Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this series. And now that you're all settled, I'm going to ask you to please stand for an opening prayer. Holy wisdom, lamp of learning, bless the light that reason lends. Teach us judgment as we kindle sparks of thought your Spirit sends. Sanctify our search for knowledge and the truth that sets us free. Come illumine mind and spirit, joined in deepest unity. Vine of truth, in you we flourish. By your grace we learn and grow. May the word of Christ among us shape our life, our search to know. Joined to Christ in living, dying, may we help the church convey witness to the saving gospel, bearing fruit of faith today. Welcome to what I am calling a seminar, Truth Matters, a seminar on seeking, discovering, interpreting, articulating, and abiding in truth. I know, easy for me to say. So I want to talk about the title, Truth Matters. This is a deliberate play on words. Truth is consequential, it's important, so truth matters, but we're also going to be exploring issues involved in seeking and discovering and articulating and all those things. So there are matters of truth that we will be considering. What's the motivation for me? Honestly, this is a personal quest for me. And I tried to put a turning point that got me thinking about this, and it actually goes back to the very beginning of the first Trump administration. You may remember when Kellyanne Conway was the spokesperson for Donald Trump, and she was challenged about something that she said, and she responded by saying that she was talking about alternative facts. And I had never heard that phrase before, and I was immediately suspicious, and since then, I have been on the lookout for people who are ostensibly sharing alternative facts. And it got me to thinking about what does it mean to search and seek and identify what truth is all about. I'm guessing that other people share that quandary a little bit. So another motivation for me is an attempt to be of service to all of you who are participating in this. Perhaps together we can figure this out. The method and presuppositions, I'm calling it a seminar. It's a very complicated topic, and I own that it needs input not just from me, but from all of you. I don't come here with all the answers. Rather, I view my role as to seed the conversation that will take place. Each session that we're going to do is self-contained, but at least in my mind, they build on one another. So your insights, your experience of seeking and articulating and interpreting truth is as important as mine is here. Tonight, this is what I hope we can do. Part one will be an overview of how the approach to truth in contemporary society has changed. Even that's more complicated than meets the eye. As I was thinking about what to share, there is much that hasn't changed, but there are some things that have changed that make the pursuit of truth a little more adventuresome and a little more complicated. Then, after I present some things, and by the way, what I present tonight is going to be sketchy. It's going to be incomplete. Again, the point is just to get the juices flowing so that we can think together and talk about it. Okay? So after my presentation for the first part, we'll have some small group conversations at the table. Part 2 will consider impacts on self-understanding and interpersonal relationships. How has this changed approach to truth affected us as individuals and who we are in relationship to one another? Again, small group conversations. I'll provide some discussion questions and a closing prayer. And on paper, we're done by no later than 8:30. Okay? So just so you know the limitations of my presentations and the need for all of us to do this together. I'm calling it a seminar because it requires all of our wisdom. So what hasn't changed? I don't want to go there just yet. So several years ago, I read a book by a cultural anthropologist named Rappaport. For many years, he was a professor at the University of Michigan. And this book is called Ritual and Religion in the Making of Humanity. I recommend it, but you have to read it while you're wide awake because it's very dense. But near the beginning of this book, he talks about the role of language in human evolution. And he says really good things happened when human beings were able to use language, but there were what he called vices that came along with the use of language. And one of those is lies. So lying is not by any means new to the human being. And he defines the lie as the willful transmission of information which is thought by the transmitter to be false. So let me say that again. The willful transmission of information which is thought by the transmitter to be false. And he says it's related to a more general occurrence that he calls deceit. And he says deceit implies an intention to mislead to the disadvantage of those who are misled, particularly with respect to those misleading them. Okay? Deceit implies intention to mislead. It often employs lies, and lies are often deceitful, but not every deceit is necessarily something we consider a lie. And the example he gives is, suppose there's a sick child who may be a very sick child, and we say to that person, you're going to be okay. Okay? That's a deceit, but we wouldn't necessarily consider that a lie. Okay? We're just trying to mislead a little bit. And this is important. He said the notion of deceit presupposes the existence of a relationship of trust, which the deceit then violates. Let me read that again. The notion of deceit presupposes the existence of a relationship of trust, which the deceit then violates. And then he says something that struck me when I first read this 25 years ago. The problem of the lie is not only embedded in language and thus in the essentials of human nature, but is a fundamental one for human society. What is at stake is not only the truthfulness or reliability of particular messages, but credibility, credence, and trust themselves, and thus the grounds of the trustworthiness requisite to systems of communication and community generally. Lies undermine society. Lies undermine community. Okay. Notice they come with language. Okay, so there's no way we can simply say that we just get rid of them, although it would be good if we could. But as long as we're speaking language, the possibility of lies in the conversation is going to be there. Another vice that he identifies with language is what he calls alternatives. He says alternatives happen when not only do we have words that stand for something, but when we can make sentences and we can paint worldviews, we can paint pictures of what our experience is all about and what the world is all about. But one of the things about alternatives is that we not only describe what order does prevail, but we move into the habit of saying what should prevail, of what ought to prevail. This next one's a little wordy, but I'll try to explain it. The actuality or reality of any symbolically contingent element of the world. I'm going to back up here. He says we discover physical elements in the world, but when we paint alternatives, we have to construct that alternative. And its effectiveness depends on how well we construct, establish, and maintain it by those who would take it to be actual. Okay. And he goes on to say, this leads to the question of how humanity grounds the truths it must fabricate and how to distinguish them from falsehood. Again, it leads to the question of how humanity grounds the truths it must fabricate and how it distinguishes them from falsehood. So, we use language. Language is part of what it means to be human. But as a result of that advance in human evolution, there are vices that come along with it, one of which he identifies as lying, another is alternatives. Okay? You with me so far? Okay. Something else that hasn't changed is that we have ideologies. Are you familiar with the term ideology? It's a very technical term. As I was researching it, I discovered that it came into the lexicon probably in the late 18th century. And an ideology is a form of social or political philosophy in which practical elements are as prominent as theoretical ones. So an ideology involves theoretical and practical. It is a system of ideas that aspires both to explain the world and to change it. Okay? Both to explain the world and to change it. As you hear about these things, see if you have any resonance in your experience of truth in our life, in our time. So there was a Frenchman, and I'm going to butcher this name, A-L-C, the last name is D-E-S-T-U-T-T, de Tracy. Anyway,
That guy.
pardon me?
That guy.
Yeah, him. Okay. So he identified 5 elements to ideology back in the late 19th century, but I think as I've read things about ideology since then, I think these elements remain relatively consistent. So it is it contains an explanatory theory of a more or less comprehensive kind about human experience and the external world. So it's an explanatory theory about world and experience. But it sets out a program in generalized and abstract terms of social and political organization. So it's not just explaining, it's going to start getting practical about what it should be. And this is very interesting to me. An ideology conceives the realization of this program as implying and entailing struggle. I want this order of the world that this ideology is supporting, and in order to get that, there's going to have to be a struggle. The ideology does more than try to persuade people about what it's about. It tries to actually recruit people into being involved in this struggle and making the new world order come about. And an ideology appeals to a wide public, but historically it seems to give a special role to intellectuals in society. So in a nutshell, an ideology doesn't only want to describe society, it wants to prescribe society. It wants to set up a rationalization for how things ought to be. Very often that happens because the person who is describing the ideology doesn't like the way things are. And this person, the writer, wants to set in motion something that's going to change things with a justification that is going to seem compelling to those who hear it. Does that make sense? Okay. So now, what has been changing? I think, in a nutshell, there's the advent of the internet, social media, and artificial intelligence. Those things are newer. So they take the vices of lying and alternatives and the strategies of ideology, and now these are magnified and in some ways made more elusive by the advent of social media, internet, artificial intelligence. What is changing is happening at different rates in different sectors of society. So just last week, I found an article written by a man named Philip Bump, and it was entitled, "The Right-Wing Media Machine is Hitting a Wall." In the course of this article, he talks about an interview with Jesse Waters. Do you know Jesse Waters? Jesse Waters is a journalist with Fox News. And he says Waters was trying to explain how the right, the political right, elevates stories. And I'm going to quote Waters. He said, "We are waging a 21st century information warfare campaign against the left. And they are using tactics from the 1990s. Okay, we're using 21st century tactics. The left is using strategies from the 90s. He said, mocking Democrats' reliance on news conferences and traditional media stories. That's old-fashioned approaches to truth. Okay? He goes on to say, what you're seeing on the right is asymmetrical. It's like grassroots guerrilla warfare. Someone says something on social media, Musk retweets it, Joe Rogan podcasts it, Fox broadcasts it, and by the time it reaches everybody, millions of people have seen it. And then the writer goes on to say, this, Waters insisted, reflected the right's interest in expressing information in contrast to the left's suppressing information. See any evidence of ideology in that? Huh? I mean, I think ideologies are at work here. I already said that. Now there's another book that I read in the last few months. I found this in a neat little bookstore in Chagrin Falls that you may be familiar with. The title just went out of my mind, but the title of the bookstore. But this book is called, by a man named Stephen Brill, it's called The Death of Truth. And the subtitle is, How Social Media and the Internet Gave Snake Oil Salesmen and Demagogues the Weapons They Needed to Destroy Trust and Polarize the World, and What We Can Do About It. Stephen Brill is part of an organization called NewsGuard. He is on one end of the spectrum, his partner is on the other end, and they are deliberately on opposite ends so that they can kind of keep each other honest in what they're doing. And what they try to do is seek out what's going on with respect to truth in society. Okay? And I learned some things in here that were interesting and in some ways shocking to me. He has he says, the internet and social media make widespread dissemination of disinformation and misinformation possible, not only within the U.S., but by U.S. media, but by foreign actors as well. And he distinguishes between disinformation and misinformation. Disinformation are things that people deliberately put out there to mislead. It would be a deliberate form of deceit. He says misinformation is what happens when somebody picks that up and doesn't realize it's disinformation and passes it on as if it were authentic information. So that's the difference he has between disinformation and misinformation. He has a chapter in here, chapter 7, called Buying Blind. This is very complicated, and I hope I don't screw it up. So he talks about how ads appear on the internet in on websites and social media and how ads are disseminated. And he talks about someone who is a programmatic advertiser. This is someone who has what he calls a platform that includes all the available ad space on websites and internets. You could go into the 40 or 50,000, even more ad spaces. It says this person has these ad spaces and someone else creates an ad and wants to sell the ad. And the way he sells the ad is by being in touch with this demand-side platform. But what's really interesting is the seller is not interested in the content of the ad or what appears around the ad. There is a very, very sophisticated and algorithmic way in which every time we get on social media or the internet, we are tracked. People know what we're logging onto, they know what we're watching, and a database about our viewing habits and interaction habits is built. And so the advertiser goes out and creates a profile of, so the website knows who it wants to come to its website. And so it knows what kind of people who look at ads are going to come to their website. So they create one of these profiles of an ad seeker, and they let the ad provider know what that profile is, and then the ad provider sells it for the cheapest rate. And what's interesting, a couple of things are interesting. One is this happens millions of times a day. Millions of times a day. The publishers and the content around which the ad appears and which the ad is financing are no longer part of the decision. The advertiser has no idea where the ad is going to end up. The advertiser and its agency have no idea where among thousands of websites the ad will appear. This happens millions of times a day, many times in a fraction of a second, because it's all algorithmic. And the example that he gives about how the ad, he gives many, but the one that first comes up is that the #1 advertiser on Sputnik News, the Russian disinformation website controlled by the Kremlin, was Geico, Warren Buffett. Geico has to do with serving American interests, but because of the way these programmatic advertising algorithms work, Geico had no idea that they were financing on Sputnik the Russian disinformation arm. And this happens over and over and over again. There was a lawsuit filed against Google's programmatic advertising, and as of 2023 it was still pending. And this is what the lawyer said in court. He said, one might think that a website with 3 pages and 3 different ad slots per page would have a total of 9 unique ad units to sell. But because online ads are targeted at individual users, the same site with 1 million readers actually has 9 million different units to sell. Each of the website's impression targeted to each individual reader. And we have no idea that's going on. It's happening algorithmically and almost instantaneously over and over and over again every day. Hundreds of billions of opportunities every day. So what has been changing? In his chapter 8, Brill says this: with state-sponsored propagandists, political extremists, conspiracy theorists, health hoax promoters, and other snake oil salesmen, and just plain deranged people with an internet connection being so much a part of the online news diet that has replaced the pre-social media news sources, And with there now being a 50-50 chance that an American reading a local newspaper website is reading an imposter, it should be no wonder that readers don't know whom or what to trust. As a result, many don't trust anything. And then he goes on to say in the next chapter, we have seen in the dismal poll numbers about trust in both traditional media and the digital news that has taken its place, that if we cannot rely on the information being pushed out to us, too many of us will believe that what is false is true, and what is true is false. Or will just believe that nothing is true or false, and that everything, except perhaps the weather, is a matter of opinion, though we'll disagree on the causes of increasingly frequent severe weather events. So is there a need to consider what's involved in, to go back to my title, seeking, discovering, interpreting, articulating, and abiding in truth? Seems to me like this is an urgent need. Urgent. So now I'm going to turn to the experts and ask you at your table to consider some questions. What parts of what I just presented did you find most helpful and or compelling? What parts did you disagree with? And how would you refine or add to the presentation? How about if you take a moment just in silence to think about those, and then on my cue I'll ask you to talk about it at your tables. Remembering no one of us here has all the answers or the only answer, please feel free to share your wisdom at your table now. It certainly did not take a long time for conversation to get animated. I hadn't planned on this for now, but I want to take just a couple of minutes. Anybody want to share anything that happened at their table that they think the whole group could benefit from?
I think it's very difficult with our children to inform them because they're on all of this and they believe all of this. And I know we can't conquer the world. We're just going to have to do this with a lot of prayer and a little bit at a time and be strong about what we feel. If we can throw something in the TV, since that's one of the medias, and just have, and I know it's not the Disney we grew up with, but something to feed them, to make them aware of something. They're not aware of anything. They're just used to turning on some cartoon and watching it or whatever game they play.
I agree that children have a special challenge with them. I would also venture to say that they are aware of many things we're not. One thing which you may have noticed is that we didn't talk much about what truth is in this first section. We're going to get to that question in depth in the subsequent sessions. We're setting the context for how society works, makes it challenging and poses particular adventures for those who seek truth. So now I'd like to move to part two. This one is not as long as part one. To consider the impacts of all of what I just talked about and what you talked about at the table on our self-understanding, excuse me, and interpersonal relationships. And in summary, I would say there's a lot of anxiety and uncertainty in people. I have had that in myself, but I think in the last few years, people identifying that as what's going on inside of them has escalated Okay, I think that's higher now. Living in a bubble. Okay, people tend to associate online with people who think the same way they do. Okay? Polarization. We had a whole workshop on this prior to the election. Okay? And as Brill pointed out, lack of trust. That's a summary of the impacts on self-understanding and interpersonal relationships. I want to give you a little fuller explanation of some examples of the impacts. And I'm using here a book by Pamela Paul, which was published in 2021, and it's called 100 Things We've Lost to the Internet. This is an easy read. Each chapter is just a few pages, but she's a good writer, and she has a way of putting flesh on some of the theoretical things that we've been talking about here. So I'm just going to identify and quote her on 5 things that she indicates that we've lost to the internet.
Who's the author again? Sorry.
Pamela Paul. So she says, we've lost unpopular opinions. Again, I'm going to be quoting her directly. She says, voiced opinions must fit into one of several predetermined buckets placed at a safe distance in a deeply polarized social, political, and cultural landscape. It looks like we are all speaking up and speaking out, but most opinions are relentlessly held in check by the crowd. We all play it safe. We hear what we want to hear and say what we think we should say. Okay? Again, this is her description. I'm not saying you have to buy everything she says, but so we've lost, in her opinion, unpopular opinions to the internet. Empathy. She says, people tend to share posts that make them feel good and confirm their own beliefs, perpetuating what can become a closed circle of affirmation. Rather than cross into another's emotional territory, we stay firmly within our own safe spaces. In the online world, there is more speaking than hearing, and very little in the way of open listening. Basically, it's the opposite of empathy. Okay, again, this is her opinion. Secrets. This will make you a little nervous. Okay? Secrets are now on our laptops. Even if it was erased, it can be retrieved. Whatever was said or done has been caught. The internet spirits our secrets out of us and then reveals them. We can find out other people's secrets as easily as others can find ours. And she goes on to say, we are all insatiable snoops. When every secret can be uncovered, we come to live in dread of our own curiosity. And I might add here, if we're going to be talking about seeking and discovering and articulating and interpreting truth, a healthy dose of curiosity is going to be required. Okay? So if we come to live in dread of our own curiosity, that's going to be something that's going to be an obstacle. Humility. She says we've lost humility to the internet. Again, I'm quoting, being proud or showing off or bragging, as it was once occasionally known, isn't something we do in front of a small group of friends or colleagues anymore. It's something belted out to the entire internet. 4 in 10 teenagers say they feel pressure to post only content that makes them look good to others or share things that get a lot of likes or comments. The more you get, the better you are, as long as you don't look like you're trying too hard. The constant need to show off your best online angle means constructing a facade that's hard for any fallible human being to maintain. And the last thing I'm going to mention, We've lost blocking things out to the internet. So, while it's true that you can tell your story to massive numbers of people in a way that you never could before the internet, so can everyone else. And they can tell yours, or their own version of it. She has 95 other examples of what we've lost to the internet. Again, it's an easy read, and I guarantee you it will make you think. I read an article just a couple days ago by a man named Alexander Hurst. It was titled, "What Are Smartphones Stealing from Us?" He said, when mine was taken away, I found out. But anyway, in the course of this article, he opined that he thinks that there is surfacing a little pushback to all of this, and that some people are, so he mentions, for example, now he's a European, so I don't know how different it might be over there, but he says he sees more and more young people going to flip phones rather than smartphones as a kind of form of resistance. He says he knows of people who pay money for digital detox retreats. He says those stupid QR code menus are swiftly disappearing. Dating apps are ceding way to singles meetups and dinner with strangers. Although I will tell you that in my experience as a priest working with couples preparing for marriage, in the last couple of years, I've had a higher percentage of couples saying that they met online in dating apps. So I'm not sure that I would agree necessarily with his assessment of that. Okay. Now, Jean mentioned the difficulty with young people and dealing with young people. I mentioned in one of my homilies this book, The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt. It's how the great rewiring of childhood is causing an epidemic of mental illness. And this is very well researched, very well written, and his contention is that people born from 2010 on have been very, very much shaped and changed by social media, the internet, in ways that those of us who came before haven't been. And so he presents a lot of data about that, but then in the course of his presentation, he asks the question, well, what might we do to counteract some of the negative consequences that the research is showing is happening? And so, interestingly, even though he is an atheist, he says we have to retrieve some of what he calls some spiritual realities. Okay? So I'm going to share the things that he said we should share. So suggested pushback. He calls this shared sacredness. He says the strongest and most satisfying communities come into being when something lifts people up so that they have powerful collective experiences. In contrast, transient networks of disembodied users interacting asynchronously, that means not all at the same time, just can't cohere the way human communities have from time immemorial. Okay, this is an echo of what Brill's saying about trust being lost and what happens to the fabric of society when that happens. A second spiritual reality that he identifies is embodiment. Now, we might not think of embodiment as spiritual, but he points out that we are all embodied creatures. We are all embodied human beings. What happens when we get on social media and the internet is we lose touch with our embodiment. So he says humans are embodied. A phone-based life is not. Screens lead us to forget that our physical bodies matter. Okay, think what's lost. I mean, just go to a Zoom meeting and have 6 or 8 people on the screen. Nobody knows who's looking at whom, who's directly interacting. That whole sense of embodiment is diminished, if not lost. Stillness, silence, and focus. He says, if we want to experience stillness and silence, and if we want to develop focus and a unified sense of consciousness, we must reduce the flow of stimulation into our eyes and ears. We must find ample opportunities to sit quietly. I'm not proud of this, but I will tell you that there are many, many times when, as soon as I sit down, my phone comes out and I'm scrolling through news items. Every once in a while, I have to be very disciplined, just put this down and just be. Okay? And I think that that's something that is not unusual in our society today. So cultivating stillness, silence, and focus. Transcending the self. To experience more self-transcendence, we need to turn down things in our lives that bind us tightly to our egos, such as time on social media. We need to seek out conditions and activities that have the opposite effect, as most spiritual practices do, including prayer, meditation, and mindfulness. I found this one very interesting. To push back on what's happening with all this social media, internet stuff, be slow to anger and quick to forgive. And this is what he says about that. Religious injunctions to be slower to judge and quicker to forgive are good for maintaining relationships and improving mental health. Social media trains people to do the opposite. Judge quickly and publicly, lest ye be judged for not judging whoever it is that we are all condemning today. Don't forgive, or your team will attack you as a traitor. And then find awe in nature. He says awe can be triggered in many ways, but the beauty of nature is one of the most reliable and accessible methods. If we want awe to play a larger and more beneficial role in our lives, we need to make space for it. So take a look at the blood moon if you can. Pardon me? I think it's happening now, isn't it?
Yeah, tonight, like 2 in the morning.
Okay, 2 in the morning. So set your phone to wake you up.
You can see it on the internet.
Good point, everybody here. That'll be on the internet tomorrow.
Right, that is true.
Okay, so now I'm going to turn you back to your tables with some more questions to talk about. What, if any, of the impacts on self-understanding and interpersonal relations resonated with your own experience? The things I taught, what resonated with your own experience? What did you have yourself saying, yeah, I know, okay, yeah, I know. What other effects of the internet and social media would you add to the ideas I presented? Now, this is admittedly an initial response, and maybe we shouldn't get to this right away, just consider the first 2, but eventually, how does what we considered tonight affect our seeking, discovering, interpreting, articulating, and abiding in truth? So take a moment of silence to just consider those first 2 questions, and then after a while I'll bring you to the third, okay? I'll just say that one of the ironies in preparing this presentation was I did a fair amount of research on the internet. Okay, so consider those first 2 questions at your table, remembering that we're seeking collective wisdom here. So I'm going to ask you over the course of the next week to think more about that third question. How does what we consider tonight affect our seeking, discovering, interpreting, articulating, and abiding in truth? I've got some ideas about that, but I think we have a room full of wisdom, and I'll be probing your own ideas about this. Those 5 words are on the flyer, so if you go to the flyer that advertises the program, you'll find them there. I want to thank you for being here tonight. I think it seemed like there was good energy. People seemed to converse easily and with some good humor. And I think that's very helpful. One of the things that we can use in our place and time is some good humor. And so we need to be able to inject that into the conversation. So that would be one thing I would answer for that third question.
Thank you.
You know, next week, the topic is why recognizing different kinds of truth matters. It might seem counterintuitive that there's more than one kind of truth, but there is. And when I look around the room, I can see people who will be able to speak to those different kinds of truth. One of those is artistic truth. And we have some artists here who can speak about artistic or aesthetic truth. Scientific, there are people here with scientific backgrounds who can speak about what's involved with scientific truth. Historical truth, I know we have at least one historian here, Cal. Okay. And so forth and so on. So religious truth. So what I will try to do is open up some of those different kinds of truth and the impact it has on how we seek and articulate it, etc. But then really we'll rely on those of you who have particular competence in those areas to see what it is that you might be able to add to that. Okay? So again, thank you. We're ending a little bit early, but I don't think that's a bad thing. Please stand so we can sing a closing prayer. Lead us from death to life, from falsehood to truth, from despair to hope, from fear to trust. Lead us from hate to love, from war to peace. Let peace fill our hearts, let peace fill our world, let peace fill our universe. Lead us from death to life, from falsehood to truth, from despair to hope, from fear to trust. Lead us from hate to love, from war to peace. Let peace fill our hearts, let peace fill our world, let peace fill our universe.